everyone, and welcome to this Authors in Conversation panel featuring 4 of the 2020 Minnesota Book Awards finalists in the General Nonfiction category. The Minnesota Book Awards is a program of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library in the organization's capacity as the Minnesota Center for the Book. This year's Book Awards are sponsored by Education Minnesota and the General Nonfiction category through the generosity of Brainfuse. We have 4 finalists in the General Nonfiction category with us, and I'd like to introduce them one after the other. First, though, I'm Jack Elhigh. I'm a past nonfiction winner in the Minnesota Book Awards, and it's my honor and privilege to be talking with these authors today. Joining me today are Erika Lee, author of America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in the United States, published by Basic Books. Maggie Ryan Sandford, author of Consider the Platypus, Evolution Through Biology's Most Baffling Beasts, illustrated by Rodica Prato and published by Black Dog and Leventhal. Nancy Atkinson, author of 8 Years to the Moon, The History of the Apollo Missions, published by Page Street Publishing Company. And David Treuer, author of The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, Native America from 1890 to the Present, published by Riverhead Books, Penguin Random House. Thanks again for being here with us. What I'm going to do is ask each of you in sequence a question that's particular to your book. And then I'd like to pose to you a question, kind of a round robin kind of question that I hope all of you will be able to answer. And my first question is for Erika. Erika, you write of an America that on one hand celebrates certain historical aspects of immigration, but on the other hand, America harbors long-standing fears, suspicions, and hatred of people who arrive in the US from elsewhere. Do you think, based on your research and all of your thinking on this topic, there can ever be a resolution of that divide in our society?
Thank you, Jack. Thanks for your question. Hi, everyone, and thank you to the Minnesota Book Awards for organizing this virtual Meet the Panelists session. It's a great opportunity to talk about literature, and with so much going on in the world, there's so much that we need to learn and to highlight and uplift from both nonfiction and fiction writing. Jack, your question is one that I've been asking myself for many, many years. Essentially, is the United States really a nation of immigrants, or is it a nation of xenophobia? And I used to be much more hopeful about bridging this divide, but after writing this book, after doing this research, and certainly living in these current times during a pandemic and during a time of rising xenophobia, I'm afraid that hopefulness and confidence has just not sustained me. So history has showed that immigration has always been a source of perennial debate and division. This is because xenophobia is not just about immigrants and about immigration. It's really about who has the power to be American, who has the power to define what American is, who gets to enjoy the privileges of American citizenship, the full resources and opportunities that the United States is supposed to deliver to its people. This divide has more often than not been a matter of race. And so essentially when we think about how and why we still have structural racism and discrimination, we can better understand how xenophobia will continue to divide us today and unfortunately for the foreseeable future, not just in the United States, but also globally.
Just a very quick follow-up. Is that a way of thinking that you arrived at from your work on the book, or were you there already when you began your research and writing?
I'd like to say I was there already, but no, I've written about immigration and about xenophobia in previous books before. I teach immigration history. This is what I do. I'm supposed to help my students better understand just how we got here and what's at stake. And in my previous books, I always ended in this moment of hope. The epilogue was always, this is a really difficult history. This is a really dark, these are dark chapters in our past. But if we hold true to our ideals, if we remember what unites us rather than what divides us, then we can get to that future. And unfortunately, with this book, what I saw was not just how successful xenophobia has been as a form of division and building on precedent, morphing according to whatever the immigrant threat is of the day, but also how it's been institutionalized, in our politics. It's been part of the way in which we think about who counts as in and who counts as outside the United States, and how it's been promoted, how it's part of our economy and unfortunately our democracy. So unless we have this radical restructuring, and who knows, during this time of pandemic, perhaps this is one of the areas that will be addressed. I'm afraid that this undercurrent, this tradition of xenophobia will continue to not just rise and fall during times of anxiety and crisis, but drive us as an undercurrent of the United States.
Okay, thank you, Erika, for that, and good luck.
Thanks.
Next, Maggie, and my question for you about your book is, how does the examination of unusual animals, unusual creatures, give us insights into the nature of evolution?
The twist ending to the book is that most animals are in fact strange in some way. So even the cat ends up teaching us something about evolution that no other animal can teach us. I started with the idea of using strange animals because it seemed like something that people could wrap their minds around. An animal is strange, therefore it must have some special evolutionary thing going on. For instance, the giraffe has a long neck, and understanding ultimately that the way that the giraffe got its long neck is just as strange as the way that a cat ended up being a cat is one of the many through lines that I tried to use in the book to help people understand that evolution is a really complicated mosaic of changes that have happened to animals over time, and plants and all organisms over time, and that no one particular thing can explain all of evolution. So if you talk at the beginning about a giraffe having a long neck, it has long vertebrae, it doesn't have multiple vertebrae, it has many muscle changes that make for the long neck to be possible. And that's not even getting into the underlying genetic reasons that a giraffe's neck is long. So by the time you get to the end of the book, when you mention that a turtle's shell is also elongated vertebrae, just like the giraffe at the beginning of the book, you can just mention the thing about the vertebrae that now everybody understands, and also talk about genome length contributing to the reason a turtle is a turtle. That is to say that certain animals have more DNA in, or more base pairs in their genomes than others, and that's one of the many factors that contributes to evolutionary changes at a genetic level. So the idea was strange animals, sure, everybody likes animals, sure, but by learning those weird little details along the way, you have a greater understanding by the end of the book about what evolution's all about. And anybody who writes about science knows that it's really complicated is sort of always the thesis. But I tried to use the structure of the book almost like a DNA of evolution itself to help you understand how it's complicated.
You a couple of times mentioned cats. I'm here confined at home with two of them,
Sure.
in addition to a large number of adult humans. and one of those cats has been begging to get into this room the entire time we've been talking now.
Yeah.
But are there evolutionary lessons from cats that you can clue us into?
Absolutely. The biggest one is that they are domesticated animals, but which means that they've co-evolved with humans. Their existence and our existence are intertwined, and there are ways in which humans have evolved that we may not have if cats hadn't evolved with us, catching our vermin and being part of our lives in the way that they've been part of our lives. The cool thing about cats, and I don't think this will come as a surprise to anyone who has one, is that they also have this whole other aspect of their behavior that's still wild. Cats come and go as they please. They haven't evolved to need us in the same way that dogs have. So they also have this whole set of behaviors that is essentially wild, where they are territorial with each other and with other animals. And when they show up, unless they're confined with us as house cats, even a house cat that stays inside has behaviors that show you that it could kind of take you or leave you.
Well, thank you for that. And good luck to you too.
Thank you so much.
Next question is for Nancy. And my question is, are there popular misconceptions that your book corrects about the space race or the Apollo missions in particular?
Well, I didn't set out to write a book that was a myth debunker, but I hope that it really does set the record straight on what Apollo really entailed. So the Apollo program was so much bigger than just astronauts going to the moon. One fact that seems to surprise people is that Apollo took the work of over 400,000 people across the country and around the world. So it was this huge effort. And I wanted to share the stories and experiences of some of those 400,000 who worked behind the scenes, who haven't been recognized like the astronauts were, and who haven't had a chance to tell their stories. So as I said, Apollo was a huge effort and a technological achievement that I believe is unparalleled in human history. You know, to go from launching the first human into space in 1961 and then just 8 years later to land people on the moon. It was such an amazing and audacious achievement that to date, no other country has replicated it. And not to mention the United States hasn't done it again either. It was expensive. It was extremely difficult. It required hundreds of thousands of people to design, build, test, all these things that had never been done before. But the 1960s just somehow was this perfect storm of a combination of technology breakthroughs, such as the integrated circuits for computers. In the 60s, computers were the size of rooms, but integrated circuits allowed them to be small enough to fit inside of a spacecraft, and to be able to be fast enough to do real-time computations to guide a spacecraft going 25,000 miles per hour. And the timing of the Apollo program was this perfect storm as well, because of Cold War fears about communism and wanting to show that democracy was better, and people just seemed to get caught up into the space race. And I wrote that launching rockets became a national priority. It was just that kind of environment. So if anyone is of the persuasion that we never went to the moon, or if they have doubts about it, just keep in mind that 400,000 people would have had to keep that secret, and they would have had to keep it secret now for over 50 years. Also, as I detailed in the book, other countries, specifically Australia and Spain, helped NASA track and communicate with the Apollo spacecraft. And other countries too had the capability to track the spacecraft, most notably the Soviet Union. They monitored the Apollo flights. And if those transmissions, those TV broadcasts of the moonwalks that millions of people watched on television, if those transmissions weren't coming from the lunar surface, dozens of countries could have called the US out on it. But if you still have doubts, then I'd really like to have you be able to sit down face to face with any of the 40 Apollo engineers and scientists that I interviewed for the book and listen to their stories and their experiences. And I'm pretty sure they'd be able to set you straight.
I should mention that my own father was one of those 400,000. He was a project engineer who worked on the descent engine of the lunar module. Working
that's awesome.
a subcontractor with Grumman. And his own father, my grandfather, doubted the truth of the Apollo missions, which
Oh.
infuriated my father. So there is such a need, such a need for more convincing. But I was also happy to see, and maybe you could say a few words about this. It's just not, was not only a technological gathering of people, but also a cultural gathering. My father was really adrift once the Apollo missions ended, and he wasn't working on them anymore.
Yeah, I would say everyone, all the people that I interviewed and talked to, you know, they're kind of saddened, I guess, by the way things have turned out. You know, we all thought we'd be on Mars by now, and you know, maybe have had more of a kind of a spacefaring society. But I would say that Apollo, though, really helped set a generation on course towards science and engineering careers. I think there was a survey done for the Apollo 40th anniversary, and they surveyed engineers and scientists, and I think it was over 60% said that Apollo was an inspiration for them to pursue the career that they did.
Mhm. Okay, thank you very much, Nancy, and good luck to you.
Thank you.
And now we'll move on to David. David, thanks for being here. And I'm interested in hearing what approach you have taken in your history of Native Americans that has been missing in other histories.
Thanks, and thanks for hosting this.
My pleasure.
I'm always homesick and for Minnesota, and this our collective lockdown and self-isolation makes me even more homesick for the homeland. So, you know, this is a small taste, and thanks for doing it. What approach did I take that was missing from other approaches? It's hard to answer. I mean, I basically wrote the book the only way I knew how. And I felt really strongly that the dominant narrative, the only way that Native history is understood is as a descending line, as a tragedy. Starting in untrammeled freedom and ending on reservations. And then very little is said about Native life after the reservation period started in the late 19th century. You know, our lives since 1890, roughly, around the time of the massacre at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota in 1890, our lives since then have sort of largely been understood as not really a kind of life at all, but just a state of perpetual suffering. And I knew that to be untrue. I felt really strongly that, you know, as Marx said, you know, all men make history, they just don't always make it as they choose. They don't make it with tools of their choosing, but they make it nonetheless, was particularly true for us. So that I felt really strongly that since 1890, we have been making history. We have been living lives. We haven't always been making it with tools of our choosing. We haven't been making history from a position of advantage, but we have been making history nonetheless. So in order to tell that story, I guess I felt I had to do three things. I had to go back to the historical record. I had to read books, and I had to recount, you know, the names, dates, and places, the major events that have defined our lives for the past 125 years. But I also felt really strongly that history isn't just a list of things that happened. History is a force that lives through us and is expressed in our lives, in all of our lives. So in order to communicate that, I had to go out into the world, and I had to travel around, and I had to talk to people and hear from them what their lives meant and what they did and where they worked and how they loved and lived and how they existed and how they did much more than merely survive. So I had to go out and talk to people. And I also felt like if I was asking all these people to talk about their lives in very raw and emotional ways, it was really unfair for me to ask them to put themselves on the line, but not to risk anything of myself. So I knew I had to put myself in the book as well. And so the resulting product, I guess, is a melange of history, reportage, and memoir. And that's just the only way I knew how to do it.
Mm-hmm. And is there an effect or influence that you would like the book to have on your readers?
Well, yeah. You know, people persist, and I think Native people, my own community, persists in thinking this way too. But there's there's a there's a sort of a consensus that Native people are in America but not of it, and that America as a modern, vibrant nation has grown up around Native communities, but excluded us from that project, and that's simply not true. You know, from the very beginning, Natives have been involved in the making of this country and continue to be involved in its sense and its shape. I mean, from the Boston Tea Party, where the colonists dressed up as Mohawk Indians, all the way to the pipeline protests in North Dakota in 2000, 15, 16, and 17. You know, we have been participants. We have been instrumental in shaping this country, and that's something which is kind of hard to convince people of, but I'm on it.
Okay. Well, thank you, David, and good luck to you.
Thank you.
And now I'm going to pose to you all the one question that I'm hoping all of you will try to answer. And Erika, we can start with you. But the question is, what has made you the author who had to write your book? And in asking that, I'm not really asking about the qualities or merits of your topic, but instead, I'd like you to tell us about your own qualities and experiences, obsessions, emotions, beliefs, motivations, whatever is within you that drove you to be the author of this book. Could you start, Erika?
Of course, yeah. Thank you for that great question. I think like David, and it was really wonderful to hear what he was saying about the ways in which he was writing his wonderful book. Mine is drawn from both scholarship. I'm an immigration historian, this is what I do, but also clearly from personal experience and family history. My grandparents were immigrants from China. They came during the period of American history that's called the Chinese Exclusion Era. This is the first time that the United States banned an entire immigrant group based on race and class. And for most of my growing up years, this is not a history that was shared within the family. This was something that we tried to forget. The focus was on becoming American and succeeding in that model. I've always been driven in my work and in my teaching in bringing forth those hidden stories, those darker chapters in American history, because they inform who we are. They help explain the inequalities that persist. But for this book in particular, I can remember the exact moment that made me feel like I had to drop everything else and explain what was going on. And that for me was the morning after the 2016 presidential elections. I had a lecture planned for my immigration history course, but I walked into the class at the University of Minnesota. Most of my students are first generation immigrants and refugees, and I just threw it out and I said, what do we want to talk about? What do you want to share with me? This is a big moment in our history. No matter how you voted, things are likely going to change, especially around immigration. What should we know? And they, student after student, focused on their fears of what were to come. They shared with me that they were fearful of being victims of hate crime. They were fearful of being deported. They were afraid that they would never see some of their families again, extended relatives who were still waiting for admission from refugee camps far away. And then they turned to asking some really difficult questions. And the questions were essentially, how could we do this? You know, how could the United States do this? Especially in 2016, after 2 terms of our first African-American president, we thought we were better than this. And I had some, some thoughts to share with them. You know, immigration's always been a complicated matter. We've always debated this. But when I went back to my office and started pulling down books from my shelves to remind myself of how historians have explained xenophobia, I realized that it was just doing a huge disservice to the here and now. They typically have explained it, and I think you hear this in the popular media too, that xenophobia rises and falls. It rises during times of economic stress, war, cultural anxiety and division, but then it falls when we feel more confident, when we're feeling at peace during times of prosperity, and we become more welcoming. And I took this sort of rise and fall narrative and looked at the larger scope of American history and realized that there's always been this undercurrent, this irrational fear and hatred of immigrants, even during good times, even during the civil rights movement, for example. There's always been one group that might be then, sort of celebrated as the typical American, the good immigrant group, but in doing that, we've also maligned another group. And so in looking at this long history, I realized that so much of the rhetoric that's coming out of the Trump administration, and that was what we saw during the election, was really repeating and refining, perhaps in more crass and explicit language than we've heard in many decades, but repeating a narrative that has been popular throughout American history. So I left class that day feeling like I really hadn't done a good job with my students, and just devoting myself to being able to answer that question more clearly the next time students turned to me and said, what is going on? How did we get here? And so that's what I did.
Okay, thank you very much, Erika.
Yeah.
And Maggie, how would you answer that question? What has made you the author who had to write this book?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It is a great question, and it's a question that I think about all the time in terms of the way that we think about science. We tend to think about science as sort of truisms of the universe that then people sort of find because of their great genius. But the reality of the situation is that science is made up of human beings studying nature and trying to find out as much about nature as we can. And each and every person who is a scientist or involved in the scientific community has a story that's led them to the work that they do. And that's actually something that I tried to include in the book as well, talking earlier about how much goes into understanding evolution. Part of it is that evolution itself is complicated in nature, but then the other part of it is that we've only figured out bits and pieces as a human race as we've gone on. And understanding why it is that we understand what we understand about evolution is of great interest to me, which is related to your question, I think. I myself come from a weird background where my family is not, in most ways, people you would think of as scientists or academics. They're artists. In some ways they are. I'm white, but my family is artists. They're lower income. I myself have a perceived gender of being female, and so I wasn't seen in a lot of ways as somebody who was supposed to be in the scientific community. And that made me keenly aware, as I became interested in science, of the ways in which one internalizes the belonging or not belonging, and how that affects. I also have a learning disability, and so that also affected my understanding of whether I belong in the scientific community. And so over time, I participated in a lot of other studies besides science. I majored in English and biology. After I graduated from college, I went to New York to work in television and study comedy and do comedy on stage, but kept getting drawn back to science. And my experiences where I felt excluded from the scientific community, and understood that there are a lot of people, I would say most people, who also feel like science isn't for them, and that puts a block on their ability to even begin to understand a lot of basic science tenets, such as what is evolution. So I think that I spent a lot of time struggling with that and feeling inferior, and trying to go back to thinking about going back to school in order to be taken seriously as a science person. And ultimately just kept getting handed opportunities where communicating science and using the comedy background and using the artistic background that I had made a career for me. And the pinnacle of that recently was that I met up with an editor who was interested in my work and offered the opportunity to have me write a book that was illustrated. And my first thought was, I don't want to write a book with pictures. No one's going to take me seriously. But then I realized that my whole career up to that point was all about trying to improve accessibility for people who, like me, and others who don't see themselves in the scientific community, and decided to think about how I could use the medium of a book in a different way that helped people with learning disabilities or who didn't see themselves in science. And I'm glad I did. So thanks again for that question.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome. Thank you for your answer. And Nancy, you're next. What within you or from your experiences made you the author of your book?
Well, when Apollo 11 landed on the moon on July 20th of 1969, I was 9 years old. And I remember sitting there with my family watching that first moonwalk. I was sitting on the living room floor, just absolutely transfixed by what I was seeing on the television screen, those kind of ghostly images of two astronauts bounding about on the moon's surface. And from that moment on, I was hooked, and I've always been interested in space exploration. However, as I grew up, I realized I had the soul of a writer and not a scientist. But I still remain very interested in space exploration. And so I feel I've got the best of both worlds to be a science journalist. And I've been a science journalist for about 20 years now. You know, even though it's exciting to write about discoveries in space and science and the technologies required, I think what I'm really passionate about is telling the story of the human experience. You know, the stories that don't normally get covered in a press release. You know, what does it feel like to make that discovery? Or what does it feel like to be the people that remotely operate the rover driving around on Mars? Or what's it like to be the first person to see pictures taken by a spacecraft, such as the one that flew past Pluto, you know, after it took 9 years for the spacecraft to get there? How does that feel? I think that space exploration really represents the best of humanity. You know, it takes dedication, commitment, passion, cooperation, inclusiveness, and taking the larger view. And those are the things that I like to write about. And I also love writing about people who work behind the scenes and don't normally get any recognition. So to be able to write a book telling behind the scenes stories about such an historic event in human history like Apollo, as well as the very event that pretty much charted the course of my life and career, I guess maybe it was inevitable that I'd write a book about Apollo. But I'm really glad that my publisher thought that the 50th anniversary was a great reason to have me write it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Nancy. And then for you, David, how does your personal essence manifest itself in your book?
I think I'm the least qualified person to talk about my personal essence. You know, I think maybe better ask my children. They'll probably give you a very different, unflattering answer. You know, but all joking aside, I mean, I do find that hard to answer, but I can say that I think this book is infused maybe more with my father's qualities than mine. I started writing this book the week after my father died in 2016, and my dad, he deserves a book of his own, but Austrian Jewish Holocaust survivor, fled to the States, as an immigrant, and had a long life of adventure and misadventure before he wound up on the Leech Lake Reservation teaching high school English, which is what you do in America, right? If you're a first, language German speaker, you definitely should end up teaching Shakespeare to a bunch of native kids in Cass Lake, Minnesota. He met my mom there, and then along come my siblings and me. These weird hybrids of Jewish native kids, right? There's so many of us in the world. But I started writing the book the week he died, and so obviously, he was on my mind a lot, and he was an irascible, strange, hilarious, unintentionally so, oftentimes, guy. He taught himself English by listening to the radio in the 1940s. So he always sounded like a 1940s radio announcer when he was yelling at us, or even just talking to us. And it was just the most improbable voice, David, it's time to eat. And he sounded like Edward R. Murrow. But I was thinking about him a lot because, shortly before he died, he died of dementia and Alzheimer's. And, that's a long, protracted way to go. And for a guy who'd survived by his wits, to lose them, by degrees was really painful for us and for him. But there gets to be a point where you've heard everything they have to say, because what they remember and what they say is much reduced and reduced and reduced until you have 2 or 3 stories that they repeat endlessly. So I thought I'd heard everything I was going to hear. But I asked him a question shortly before he died. We were having lunch, and the Trump's election was ramping up. And I just was thinking to myself, I'm like, how can you stand it? And he says, what do you mean? I'm like, how can you stand what this country does? It makes such terrible decisions. And he goes, well, what are you talking about? I said, well, this is your country of choice. You chose to come here. This is my country of birth, and America has grown up around and on top of my tribal homelands, and so I can't leave this country without leaving my tribe. And that's something I can't do, but you chose this place. And he looked at me, he had this way of looking at you like you were stupid. It was a great look. He just looks at me and he's like, that's ridiculous. He's like, this country saved my life. The Austrians didn't want me. The Germans wanted to kill me. The Belgians didn't want me. French didn't want me. The English, nobody wanted me. But I came here and they took me in and they saved my life. This country saved my life. And so it's my job to make it better. That's the deal. It saved my life, so my job is to save it from the worst things that it would do if it had the freedom to do them. Because that's the bargain. It saves me, I save it. And I thought about that a lot. I thought about the ways in which sort of, he embodied that sort of tension, right? That many of us increasingly feel, like Erika was talking about. That this country, in the words of Winston Churchill, always manages to do the right thing after it's tried everything else. And even that's not always true. Sometimes it doesn't actually get to that right thing, and it's up to us as citizens to steer it onto some better course. And so I think it was, and my book is sort of an attempt to do just that, to remind ourselves of both the good decisions and the bad, and the complicated ways in which we come together, sometimes in concord and other times in conflict, to move ahead, to try and move ahead, and to arrive at some better place. That's not naturally my outlook. I'm much more of a pessimist, perhaps, than my father. But I thought about him a lot when I wrote the book, maybe more than I thought of myself, and I was able to respond to the angels of my better nature because of him, I guess.
Thanks, David, for
Thank
that.
you.
And thank you all for your very interesting answers to that question. I think our time is up now. I just want to remind everyone that we've been in conversation with the finalists for the Minnesota Book Awards General Nonfiction category, and they were Erika Lee, author of America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in the United States, and Maggie Ryan Sandford, author of Consider the Platypus, Evolution Through Biology's Most Baffling Beasts. Also Nancy Atkinson, author of 8 Years to the Moon, The History of the Apollo Missions, and David Treuer, author of The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, Native America from 1890 to the present. Thank you all so much for being here, and good luck to you all, and happy writing in the future.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.